Today is the second session of my presentation about Islam in general, Islam in Europe, and now today, Islam and politics. I think you will find more in-depth information of what I will try to say in our EMU guidelines, which you all have. And so if you have maybe further questions or you want to have more insights also, it's always worth to read our EMU guidelines. The intention of the idea of today is basically to introduce also the talk of Jacob tomorrow, which will be, as you all know, about basically the concrete results of the online research we have all done together. So if you remember yesterday, I tried basically to indicate that Islam is, first of all, a problem of definition. I mean, I just basically reminded everybody that Islam is a very wide field. And in fact, I mean, I tried to highlight that Islam is also a lot about other things than just politics. And I think that was important just to give you a general idea that Islam, in fact, is a big subject, a big topic, and in fact, politics is one of it. But today, of course, I want not to escape from the, let's say, more problematic side of the presence of Muslims in Europe. Beyond all the other issues like culture, philosophy, social life, and economics, I think we are now facing more of the kind of Islam as a problem, Muslims as a problem, and so on. So yesterday I did introduce the idea, the triangle, in fact, that Islam is basically has three dimensions, which are Islam, Iman, Ihsan. And I did talk quite a bit about implications of law, theology, of tasawwuf. Tasawwuf is an Arabic word for, basically you could translate into spirituality. So people have a spiritual experience. In my presentation of yesterday, I also introduced the famous 5 pillars of Islam, which, as you remember, was part of the narrative of the Prophet, peace be upon him, about defining Islam. We had 5 pillars, of course, the famous ones, which is the Shahada, which is basically the confirmation of Islam, the fasting, the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage, Zakat, and the prayer. Now, if you think about the debate about the presence of Muslims in Europe and the debate about Islam in general, I mean, you may argue, well, I mean, would it not be the easiest solution that Islam is just private? It's a private praxis. And if you go now through the 5 pillars, I mean, Shahada, which is the confirmation, yes, I mean, you could do that privately. Fasting, a bit more complicated because, as you know, it is a public event in a sense, causing sometimes some legal problems like do children, for instance, fast in schools and things like that. So it's a bit kind of private and public. Hajj, which is the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia, of course, is quite public. I mean, millions of people traveling to Mecca and Medina, which also involves some geopolitical questions even. I mean, how can you access Mecca and Medina? And Zakat, which is the required contribution, which is like 2.5% of your wealth you have to give to poor people in your place, in your location. I mean, again, it's basically more public really, because I mean, whoever gathers the zakat and distributes it, I mean, it's a social event, a public event, it's not just private. And the same is true for the prayer, because I mean, for instance, if you think on the Friday prayer, I mean, of course you have to go to a mosque. I mean, if it's a big mosque, you may gather a couple of thousands of people. The imam would maybe give a talk. He will give a talk, in fact, in the form of the khutbah. So I just want to indicate to you, this is a mix basically of private and public elements. And so if you think on one of the possibilities to answer the question, what is Islam? And you may answer, it's a religion. I think here also is indicated that Islam is, in a sense, slightly more than just a religion, because it has social, economical, and political implications. And the famous term, I mean, which sometimes the right-wing populists in Europe are using, is the Islamization going on in Europe. Well, however you see it, I mean, yes and no, because as you know, there are many mosques, there are many Muslims, there is public life. And yes, there is a kind of, I would not use the word Islamization, but let's say influence of Muslims in Europe. But also elements are missing, because if you remember, I also talked about what is really the core of social life of Muslims. It would be the mosque, the market, and the foundations. And what you see now in Europe is many mosques, but no markets, no foundations. So it is a kind of yes and true, yes and no to the question, is there a kind of Islamization? Is a problematic word, but let's take it. I mean, is there a kind of Islamization in Europe? I would say yes and no. Just to come closer to the idea of Islam in politics, of course, we also discuss in Europe very much the idea of Islamophobia. This is a report I was just reading. I mean, it's like a couple of hundred of pages about reports of discrimination of Muslims in Europe. And of course, lots of young Muslims also are complaining that there is a everyday discrimination going on, to an extent also kind of racism if Muslims have an immigration background. So there's lots of kind of talk about that from the Muslim side. But I also want to highlight, of course, this is not just the whole story, because there's the other side of a reality in Europe, which is basically caused through the terrorist attacks, where, of course, I mean, people in Europe are very much concerned about the reality, the intentions, and the future of Muslims in Europe. So it's a kind of two-sided phenomena. And just to give you one very practical example, I mean, I don't know if you have been informed in your media in your countries, there was like 3 days ago a very big scandal in Germany. What happened? I mean, there was in a town called Stuttgart, there was a kind of a party going on in the night with something like 400 or 500 youngsters. I mean, going to the town, celebrating the night. Lots of them drunk, some of them took drugs and so on. So it was a kind of very, very chaotic scene. What happened that the German police officers went into that crowd, and he made a kind of check on one of these youngsters, which was basically a German, and checked him through, and he found some drugs, and they tried to bring him to the police car. And then the whole scene became very chaotic. I mean, hundreds of people running through the town. I mean, they were plundering shops. I mean, they were attacking policemen. Very chaotic. I mean, lots of damage. I think 6 million euros were just the damage. I mean, because of lots of shops and cars and so on were destroyed. So the German public was very shocked. I mean, as I was. I mean, because it's very unusual for a town in Germany that this kind of things are happening. And what happened next day was that one of the leading German media houses was reporting that one of these youngsters, or maybe two of them, did shout Allahu Akbar while doing so, while doing all this kind of negative actions. And I was quite interested in that phenomena, because it does link to what I was trying to say yesterday. I mean, so you had this signifier, Allahu Akbar, I mean, which we use usually in the prayer, because when the prayer starts, we say Allahu Akbar. And this term was now basically linked to this whole chaotic event with all these negative images. And it's very interesting, because the signifier Allahu Akbar and the signified by it is very complicated, because Muslims would use Allahu Akbar when they are shocked, when they are surprised, when they are terrified, when they praise something. So there's many different possibilities of meaning. But the media, of course, was using this one element to define this Allahu Akbar, to define the signified by it, which is now linked in the association and in the public unconsciousness to terror, extremism, chaotic scenes, and so on. So I think that's quite a good example of what's really going on. What happened then also through the last 2 to 3 days, I mean, was a kind of shitstorm. Young Muslims complaining, well, once again, I mean, because we have 2 free criminals here in Stuttgart, I mean, all the young people in Germany, all the young Muslims in Germany are now linked to extremism and criminality and so on. While on the other side, right-wing populist groups and chats and so on try to say, well, yes, again, I mean, young Muslims very extreme. I mean, they're just preparing a civil war. I mean, Islam is very negative. Be careful about politics in Islam and all that. So just to introduce to you, this is not just a theoretical theme. It's a very practical and basically goes on now since a couple of years. So let's face the negative side of Islam. I mean, the most negative option of linking Islam and Muslims is, of course, terrorism. And in fact, as you all are aware of, I mean, since 11th of September, it's basically a main discourse in Europe about security, and the master signifier, which basically organizes all the debates, are circling around this term Islam, and very specifically about the term political Islam. So this is a problem, and I think we have to face it. I mean, if you go through our Muslim guidelines, of course, we always said, well, if we ask, I mean, does terror has a base in Islam? Of course, we would say generally no, because I mean, all the leading scholars from all different corners of the community have basically over the last years very, very clearly rejected the idea of terror in Islam, and have basically done lots of public campaigns to clarify this position. Has reached the Muslims, yes, altogether, because the absolute majority of Muslims agree to this point, while has reached the non-Muslim society up to a point. I mean, some people did listen to it, other people didn't want to hear it, some people still doubtful, and so on. So this is, of course, a core problem. I mean, I did make clear, I think also even yesterday already, my own position. I mean, is there something like Islamic terrorism? I would say no. I mean, it's a kind of paradox, because terror has no base in Islam. It's not taught by the scholars of the Muslims. So this term Islamic terrorism, I think, is clearly a paradox. I do reject it personally, and we can later on maybe debate and discuss about it. On the other hand, is there a problem with Muslim terrorists? Of course, yes. I mean, I do agree. I mean, there are, you know, I don't know what the exact number may be, let's say a couple of hundred of people in Europe who either have been involved in terrorist attacks, have even organized them, or sympathized with it. So please don't take me wrong here. I do not negate the problem as such. Yes, there are Muslim terrorists, but I do reject the term Islamic terrorism. To give you maybe a more witty example, I mean, are there Muslim bank robbers? Yes, I think there are maybe all over the world a couple of Muslim bank robbers. But is there Islamic bank robbery? I would say no, of course not. So this is, I think, for me, a very important point of discrimination. But again, I mean, I invite you to discuss that with me. So the general question here is, I mean, in how far Islam is involved in this problem of terrorism. I mean, yesterday we pointed out that Islam is never subject in history, but Muslims are. I mean, Muslims do all kinds of things, good and bad things, as any other human group. And so the whole question in the end is how is the relation between Islam and democracy, Islam and human rights, Islam and European values, and so on. So I want to go a bit into the depths of this. So let us go back for one moment back to the historic situation, which is, as you know, there was a prophet called Muhammad, and he introduced Islam because he received a revelation called the Quran. And he formed the first community of Muslims, which was based in Medina. Medina is the Arabic word for town, so it was based in a town. The first community appeared. So it's very important, I think, to understand, I mean, the situation in Medina was that a kind of state. We are talking here about the 7th century. So, I mean, of course, it was not comparable in terms of a state as we understand it today. It was definitely not a modern state for several reasons. I don't think we can even use the term state. Even some Muslims may do it, but I don't think we can use the term state because it's not really fitting into the situation of Medina in the 7th century. What we did have in that time is a kind of complex, a complicated relationship between different elements. I mean, there was a kind of government, I mean, headed by the Prophet himself. There was a lot of economics going on, which was, I think, part of the success story of Islam in that time. I mentioned that relationship between the mosque and the market, which in fact was one of the first steps the Prophet did in Medina. I mean, he opened the mosque on one side, he opened the market on the other side. You can say he connected spiritual and material elements of life. And there was, of course, a law, a new law, I mean, based on the revelation. And my point is this law, which later on developed into law schools and so on, was a very important part of that time. So, one second, I'll jump here a bit. So what was basically the principles in the beginning? I mean, and of course, I'm here quite simplifying things a bit, but let's say what was the basic principle at that time? I mean, there was a law, a new law based in the revelation, creating a kind of quite successful social life. I mean, there was expansion, I mean, commercial innovations and social innovations. I mean, the possibility to unify people in that time, which have been very divided before, was of course a very, very strong part of the success of the first community. And there was a kind of politics, yes, because the prophet, I mean, did make kind of political decisions, economic decisions, legal decisions, and so on. But my main point here, and please keep it in mind, is that law was dominating politics. So it was not that politics dominated law, rather it was law dominating politics. That was really a very strong principle in the beginning of the Islamic civilization. Maybe just in brackets also already. If you think later, let's say 21st century, of course, this whole thing went upside down. I mean, politics, let's say the politics of Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, and so on, or Turkey. I mean, of course, it was a very kind of more modern situation. So politics dominates the law. So it is a kind of upside down situation we have to keep in mind. I will come back to this later. I think it's very interesting, and you may find again, I mean, if you talk to young Muslims and you ask them, what was Medina, what was the first community? Many of them may argue, yes, it was a kind of state. So they will use a very modern term to understand the situation of Medina, but I think this is basically wrong. And there's a very, very interesting scholar, if you're interested in that subject, called Walid bin Khalak. In fact, he's Lebanese, he's a Christian also, he's not a Muslim. And he wrote a whole book about his first community. And the book is called The Impossible State, which means basically, that's the argument of Walid bin Khalak, that this combination Islamic state, I mean, that basically Muslims founding a kind of modern state and the modern way of thinking is a kind of paradox. It doesn't work. It doesn't really fit together. So we are facing here again a very substantial fundamental problem of terminology. So if you want to go deeper into this, I mean, just read this book. I mean, it clarifies basically that in the beginning of Islam, in the beginning of the political life of the Muslims, I mean, we cannot really just say this is a kind of state. I mean, we have really to differentiate here, have go deeper into this, and that's a very important point. So you can raise the question, in fact, was Madinah a state? I mean, was that kind of political situation we may think, and Walid bin Khalak makes here very interesting comments, and I will try to read this here. It's a bit complicated. Oops, I have to put that down again. So I give you the quote. I hope you can follow the quote. It's a bit complicated, but I think it's an important one. The Sharia, the paradigm of Islamic legislative power, had no political will, at least nothing comparable to the will of the state. Sharia was about society rather than politics. It was about moral, social character, not political society, one of many secondary concerns. The modern project represents and constitutes in the living reality of today's Muslim world a profound change from the age of legal morality to the age of politics. Politics are omnipresent in modern times and determine the day. Can I go back? Okay. So you may be a bit slightly confused by this kind of long quote, but just to summarize it, I mean, the argument of Walid bin Khalak here is, I mean, the Sharia and the Islamic law, therefore, was really more about moral and social character of the society as such. It was not so much political in the sense we understand it today. So there is a tremendous change. We have to realize that politics, which today are very omnipresent, are very dominant and so on, in the beginning of Islam, it was not that kind of case, because, I mean, there was a revelation, there was law, it was dealing with the society as such, but it didn't create a kind of politics. There were no parties. There was basically, it was not like that really. It was more about defining social, moral, economic behavior. And people followed that, creating a kind of success story in that time. I mean, if you compare it to the situation before, and politics were really not that kind of important. It was not really in the core of the thing. Like say any political leader in the first centuries of Islam was not able to change the law. In fact, I mean, he had just to accept it. So I just want to highlight here, it was a very different situation from today. And I think we have to keep that in mind. Okay, but you may argue, well, I mean, that's all interesting, but if we think on the famous Islamic State, which was appearing a couple of years ago in the territory of Iraq and part of Syria, you could say, well, this was called an Islamic State. I mean, they did really just try to create a kind of fundamental state. I mean, in terms of fundamentalism. Again, is a kind of complicated question here, because as you know, and I like the picture, therefore, I mean, of course, all these Muslims creating the Islamic State, I mean, they did use technology from beginning on. I mean, they had mobile phones, they had social networks. I mean, they used very modern military technology and so on. So in that sense, they were very modern, but they tried to recreate a situation like in the 7th century of Medina, trying to be very orthodox and trying to create a kind of state, in fact, which a totalitarian state, you may say, and they try to base it to Medina, but that's my point of my argumentation before. But I think it's not so easy to link. And as we all know and all are aware of, I mean, it was a very disastrous experiment, political experiment. I mean, in the beginning, some young people and some young Muslims in Europe thought, oh, well, this is wonderful, let's go to that place. It may end like Medina. And you all know how it ended. It was basically the opposite, total disaster, I mean, total destruction. I mean, one of the, I think, really bad campaigns for the image of Islam and linking Islam totally to totalitarian politics, and therefore creating this disaster we all are aware of. So let's think for one moment, okay, what was going on since Medina up to today? I mean, there's a couple of centuries, nearly 1,300 years. And of course, I mean, there's big books about that and a couple of hundred of pages, but let's summarize it just for the essence, for the sake of the essence of what I try to explain here. And we had over the centuries a situation. There was a prophet. He created a community. Of course, there was the first political problem was when the prophet died. I mean, who will be the inheritor of the prophet? And will he be like a prophet also? I mean, most of the Muslims said no, I mean, he can't, because he was not the prophet Muhammad. Whoever follows him, whoever takes on the political government, he's not a prophet himself, he's a human being and so on. And there were 4 famous caliphs, I mean, Abu Bakr, Omar, Osman, and Ali. And after the death of Ali, I mean, there was a big kind of trouble going on. And that's where really, I mean, division between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims happened, because some of them followed the inheritors of Ali, other one opposed it, and so on. It's too long story, but just to indicate. Yeah. So what happened is, but also at the same time, a big expansion of Islam. I mean, it went over several continents, and there was a kind of very complicated historical development going on. It's not the time here to explain it, but it ended in very different forms of regional government. I mean, also the leaders of that governments called themselves sultans, not caliphs anymore. And as Ibn Khaldun, which I mentioned yesterday, describes them, was like high points of civilization here and there, and changing a lot, a quite chaotic situation. Then in the, I would say around the 18th, 19th century, which is exactly the time of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, by the way, I mean, there was a big change going on, because there were new power techniques in the air. I mean, new innovations of power technologies. I mean, the innovation of banks, of bank, international trade networks. The state becomes more powerful. I mean, Europe takes the lead. I mean, creates very powerful instruments of government. And there was a kind of new things also, like nationalism, a very foreign concept for Islam, based even in race. I mean, Islam never thought like that. Capitalism became very, very strong. And in the first time in history, something like Islamic states, in the modern sense of the word, appeared. So that's just to hint the situation, the change of situation here to you. So what was the response of the Muslims all over the world? I mean, there was colonialism. So some, conquests went on that European states, European leaders, took over part of the Muslim world. There was a new thing coming up, which even Goethe was concerned of already in his time, which was nationalism. And people suddenly defined themselves as national citizens, sometimes also based in race, ethnicities. A new concept for the Muslim world. And again, new technologies arrived. Banking was introduced, new commercial institutions which have not been known by the Muslims, a new concept of state, of organization, of bureaucracy, and so on. So a complete overwhelming new situation, which basically led to the situation that it was the end of the caliphate. The Ottoman Empire was the last kind of caliphate, multi-ethnical, multi-racial, and so on, basically collapsed, and a completely new world was beginning. So this is, I think, important to see this here. So what was the response of the Muslims? In one way or the other, all the Muslims in the Muslim world had realized the state is now the really most powerful political concept. And Muslims were thinking about how to respond to that. There were different kinds of approaches. There was a fundamentalism which was saying, well, this new modern concept of the state is really not our concept, so we have to reject it. We have to go back to Mecca and Medina. We have to go back to the original community. So they basically rejected completely the idea of the state. There was the other, let's say, very influential movement, which Jacob will, I think, also talk tomorrow about it, which you could call a legalistic movement. In other words, Muslims, political thinkers also of the Muslim world, who said, well, we have to accept the state as a new modern reality, if you like it or not. So let's take over the state. Let's participate in the political life of the state, and with the ultimate aim to take it over. Let's found parties, let's find political programs and so on. Let's influence the state, let's organize our majority in the state, and let's take the state over. There was the other wing, more liberal, which basically said, well, this is a very good concept coming from Europe, democracy, national state, all fine. Let's just be part of it, let's just participate in it. So you could say what we call today political Islam has basically two main, let's say, directions. And political Islam, again, a term I don't like too much, but let's use the term for the sake of easy understanding. So political Islam basically created two main wings. One wing was very, as I said before, very fundamentalist. Today linked generally to Salafism and Wahhabism, which said, well, all these modern things, state, all these innovations, this new modern life of democracy and so on is really not for Muslims. We do totally reject it. We want to go back to our old principles of Mecca and Medina. And at least it was the idea and ideology. Again, we have to differentiate because there are also Salafists, Wahhabists who are just orthodox. They just want to be involved in politics. They just want to live their own very religious life. But let's say there is a political wing in Salafism which really wanted to go backwards. And one of the bad examples I showed you before is, of course, all these people creating the so-called Islamic State in Iraq. And there was a more legalistic wing of this political Islam grouping. Their idea was, okay, let's found parties, let's found associations, let's be pragmatic. Let's go into the state, let's take over political mandate, let's take over political majority, and if we do so, we may influence the state and put it in a kind of other direction. Also, many of these legalistic Muslims also thought, well, and also we need to accept that there's new innovations, there's new power institutions, which we have to basically just take over and Islamize them and just do the same thing and copy it, basically. And of course, some wings also had this idea, okay, let's create revolutions later on. So if we have a majority, let's say we have a democratic country, let's say Egypt, let's create a party, let's take over the state. When we have 51%, we can dominate the whole thing. And, which is now, of course, from a Western point of view, as a jurist, for instance, of course, we see the danger. I mean, if this kind of ideological movements take over the state with 51% in winning the elections, I mean, of course, we may see that can cause problems. And we had a very bad experience here in Germany, for instance. I mean, if you think about, Hitler, for instance, he was elected, in a democratic process. He took over a majority in the country. And of course, what happened afterwards, we are all aware of. I'm quite ready for a quite harsh critique on political Islam. By the way, sorry for the using here political Islam. I mean, of course, political Islam. So let's face it. Let's ask young people, young Muslims in Europe. Okay, political Islam, was it a success story? Answer very open. From my point of view, no, not at all. Because what we had is political Islam in the most extreme form created terrorism, extremism. Disaster for the Muslim world. Causing lots of victims also on the Muslim side. Creating a tremendous damage on the image of Islam. Just showing over the last years, basically decades, this absolute negative image of Islam. At some parts in the Muslim world creating civil war. So you had a secular part of the society, a more religious part of society fighting each other, creating tremendous problems. We created monarchies, which is in a sense a more old legitimate form of Islam, but today also in the light of corruption, really, if you think on Saudi Arabia, Emirates, and so on. So, not very, very sympathetic to an extent. We have created a kind of dictatorship. Again, politics dominating law. So there you have these political dictatorships which call themselves Islam, but of course are very, very kind of politicizing everything, not creating big sympathy for people. And we have now the debate in Turkey. Is Turkey moving towards a kind of dictatorship, ? So this is all in the air. Of course, this whole problem of parties, not many young Muslims are aware of that. This whole problem, we had an experience in Europe that you take over a country with a majority, with your party, and then you change the whole situation in a kind of dictatorship, a big danger, of course. And we have very little positive examples in that sense. Some people, this is arguable, but I would say, for instance, Malaysia is a very modern, technological, advanced country, quite well-functioning democracy to an extent. Turkey, as I said, is a bit kind of in between. Tunisia, for instance, the only place in the Arab world where the famous revolutions were going on, which there was no civil war. It seems to be in a kind of democratic process and so on. So what I want to say here, let's say the list of negative events linked to the term political Islam is very long. The success story of political Islam, very little. So this is, I think, something we have to face. What does it mean for organizations in Europe? In one way or the other, it has to do with this kind of development of political Islam over the centuries. In Europe, you will realize, for instance, if you go, for instance, a place like Germany, you will have big Muslim organizations which basically are based in the time where all these immigrants came to Europe. The workers came to Europe, and they came from Turkey, they came from Egypt, they came from the Arab world. And in the very beginning, this is basically in the 1960s or so, or 1970s, more or less, they created their own associations, their own organizations, but each organization was based in the ethnicity. So, for instance, there was Turkish organization, there were Egypt organization, there were Syrian organization, there were Bosnian organization. So very much differentiated between basically the background where these people come from. And of course, by this way, importing conflicts and theological and ideological conflicts from their home countries. So for instance, there's a big, deep kind of conflict, which I cannot explain because it would take too long, between Turkish Muslims and Arab Muslims. It has to do with the history of both worlds. And that kind of conflict is still represented in today's organization form. Then, of course, political Islam again was very, or let's say, organizations of Muslims in Europe were very much hierarchical, in fact. So were very much politicized. I mean, for instance, all these organizations created a kind of political structure, very hierarchical, very on the bottom of the whole thing, young people, and the whole thing was very politicized. So, for instance, not one of these organizations, for instance, have created foundations, for instance, which would be part of the civil society. You have to know that a foundation in Islam is not dominated by politics, has nothing to do with politics, completely independent from politics. Not one of these organizations has created this kind of thing. And so very hierarchical and not easy to get integrated into it. There was a big problem that all these organized Muslim organizations, I mean, they took them a long while to learn European languages. And even up to today, you may find leaders in these organizations who do not speak German, French, Italian, whatever. So very kind of cut off of the debates of the society, sometimes not even aware of it, ignoring it to an extent, which is now, of course, changing because all these young people come and very often they speak better European languages than, let's say, Turkish, Arabic, or whatever else. So, and then also all these organizations not very fit for the debate. I mean, all these attacks came to Islam and to the Muslims and so on, but not familiar how to argue, how to defend themselves and so on. So a lot of problems. And a big problem also, I mean, not a very strong connection to the base of them, all these people, you know, I mean, some of the big organizations in Germany, for instance, have access to hundreds of thousands of people, but a not very active integration of all these people, specifically not an active integration of young people. So where does that lead us to? I mean, what is the target of political Islam in general? I mean, as I said before, lots of them, in one way or the other, dream of taking over the state, to be very influential in the state. So they think very much in terms of power politics, while not many Muslim organizations have an idea of really to influence and to activate and to be creative in the civil society. And this is now a very important point, and I hope you get that. Because in a sense, they lost the balance what Islam really is, because Islam is about social life, cultural life, economical life, which is all has to do with the civil society. And there's lots of creative and positive energy from the Muslim side. There's lots of social competence, for instance, also if you go through the basics of Islam, but there's not a philosophy how to create, really how to activate, how to inspire civil society life in Europe. Rather, a lot is about power, politics, let's create a party, let's influence the state, and so on. So this is, I think, a quite big problem. So what does that all mean for us for the open campaign? I think what I would like to achieve through the campaign is really a bit more clarity about the Islamic sources in the way I try to present it. Yes, there are politics, but there's also other subjects, other topics. Islam is a very wide sphere of life, and I think we cannot just completely politicize it. Okay, we have political issues, political problems, political extremism even. Let's face it, let's talk about it, but also we have to make clear, also to the non-Muslim public, I think we have to make clear, Islam is just more than just politics. I think it needs to be viewed in a more balanced sense. I think we have to deal the whole time, I think we have to really deal with terminology, up to the point that we have to ask participants in the campaign, even young people, really clarify your terminological understanding. So if you use a word, give me the definition. And I can promise you, even if you ask young Muslims the most simple question on earth, which is, what is Islam? They will struggle to find the answer. And I think that is in itself a significant message, because if they struggle to understand terminologically what Islam really is, it means at the same time they can be influenced in different ways. They can get really on the wrong track what Islam actually is. I think, yes, it needs a kind of historic knowledge also. I think, as I tried to say before, I mean, Muslims have to understand, and we are not standing still. I mean, there's a process going on over the centuries, and each time in any point of this development, we have to give new answers. We have to, keep some basics, in fact, but also respond to new challenges, new innovations, there's no way to go back to the 7th century. We are the 21st century. I mean, people have to be aware. Yes, we have to face it and to give new answers also. I think very important for me is to make young Muslims understand why is the European public society slightly concerned about ideologies. I think we have to share our experience in Europe with the phenomena of ideologies. Let's take Germany. I mean, we had National Socialism, a very, very kind of racial concept, very ideological, I mean, which came into life through a legal process of elections and so on, destroyed the whole country, caused millions of dead people in Europe. I mean, we had the Holocaust. I mean, I think we have to share this kind of ideology experience with the Muslims, also to indicate how this ideological thinking of Europe has influenced the response of the so-called political Islam of the 20th and 21st century. I think this is a very, very important connection, and I think that needs really education for our young people. Of course, we have to clarify once again and again and again our total rejection of terror, ideologies, etc. This, I think, naturally has to be part of the campaign. But on the other hand, also, I think we have to emphasize and even support young Muslims to be totally engaged in civil society. And we have to show them this is appreciated by Europe. I mean, to be a Muslim, to be a European citizen does not mean get out of all politics. I mean, no, the contrary, I think, is true. I mean, all young Muslims should be engaged in parties, in NGOs, in civil society life, and so on. And why not argue, bring in whatever they have, but just keep the frame really of political life and see the discrimination to ideological obsession. I think that we have to, in one way or the other, have to make clear to them. Then again, I think we have to raise the idea of citizenship. I mean, whoever is born in Europe, has a European passport, speaks a European language, whatever his name may be. He may be Ali, so-and-so, but I mean, he is a fully accepted European citizen. And I think, again, this is important for the self-confidence of young Muslims, that is not forbidden to be politically engaged in Europe, but I mean, in contrary, I think it's expected to an extent. So let's get engaged in the civil society. Let's bring in whatever you have to say. Don't flee from the debate, from the discourse and so on. Feel equipped for it. Be a proud Muslim, be a proud European, and be really engaged in the whole thing. The last thing, of course, we have to help through the campaign to create a kind of positive identity, which again I would name with 3 elements. One is European citizen, talking European languages, being familiar with European debates, knowing the history of Europe, knowing the philosophy of Europe, knowing the whole concept of Europe, understanding maybe, for instance, also European foreign policies, maybe even criticizing it, but being engaged in the society. Therefore, you have to get the skills of being engaged in debates and so on. And last not least, the third point, yes, be a Muslim. I mean, be a proud Muslim, and also be aware of the paradox, because I think that is an interesting contributions of Muslims in Europe to the wider society. I mean, we have a spiritual life, a religious life, which is not just based in a concept of race, politics, and so on. In contrary, which has a spiritual kind of experience, which I think is not a bad idea to share with other people in Europe. Just, I mean, because I think that is important in any campaign in Europe, dealing with Muslims and Islam and political ideologies and political Islam also. I just want to close this session with one really serious problem, because I think that is, of course, very damaging for the image of young Muslims in Europe if they are linked in any way, in one way or the other, to anti-Semitism. Let's face it just briefly. I mean, first of all, in this idea of, or in this question, does Muslims have a kind of tendency towards anti-Semitism? I think we have to discriminate between politics and theology. I mean, if you go into the Quran, you may find some statements about the relationship of Christian, Jews, and Muslims. And if you read them, you may find a kind of strange elements in it. And but this is all about theology. It was never biopolitics. This is important to know, because I mean, if you go through the history of many centuries of Muslim civilization, of urban development of Muslim towns, you will not find one town in the Muslim world where there was not in the town a big part for Jews and a big part for Christians. I mean, in any town like Sarajevo, Cordoba, wherever you may go to, you will find there was a whole infrastructure who was Jewish, and the Muslims lived with it in quite good harmony. So that this is something I think which is part of the base of Islam. Again, I mean, once again, of course, we have to tell and share, I mean, our European experience with ideology, which, I mean, a big part of it is anti-Semitism. We have to clarify also in modernity, I mean, it was part of the heroic side, in fact, of the Muslim world, that they have allowed lots of Jews from Europe to use vanishing points in the Muslim world. I mean, one example is, I mean, lots of Jews, I mean, have been under attack in Germany in the time of National Socialism. They did in fact flee to Turkey, and they were received well there and so on. So there's a kind of history on that. And kind of tricky point also is, I mean, there is, you may know, and I did mention it in my session yesterday, there is a critique in Islam, which is basically also, I mean, based in the Quran, in the revelation itself, is a critique on usury. I mean, there's a kind of, because in Islam it's forbidden to take interest. Now, this is a quite tricky point, because if you go to the history of Germany, I mean, there was the base of anti-Semitism really started with Luther, who was the founder of the Protestant Church. And he had a very, very strong critique in his works about interest, about usury. And he linked it strongly to Jews. So there's very anti-Semitic aspects in the teaching of Luther, in fact, and which later on the Nazis, and one of their key ideologists who talked a lot about economy, called a man called Feder, he took on that argumentation of Luther and also argued very strongly against the Jews in terms of they are the usurers, they take interest, they destroy the society. Of course, forgetting that the Nazis were very, very strong capitalists in the end. But I just indicate here there's a kind of a dilemma and something we have to face. Last not least is also interesting, which I think explains quite a bit the situation in Europe. I mean, if you would ask me as a European Muslim, what was your trauma? I mean, what was the most negative experience in your Muslim life in Europe? I would immediately say Bosnia, because of course in the 90s, the Bosnian wars were very shocking for European Muslims. While when you ask lots of young Muslims today with a kind of Arab or Turkish background, they would not say Bosnia, they would say our trauma was Palestine. And again, it's a complicated story. It has to do with Israel politics in that area, tricky stuff. And I think maybe we have also to think how to respond to that in the campaign. So I hope this session was not confusing to you. I tried just to give you some general headlines about this whole phenomena of politics. And I hope you understood that me being a Muslim in Europe, being involved in Muslim communities in Europe, I am absolutely pro to discuss the whole issue of problematic sides of political Islam. I'm ready to fight, but also ready to discuss why is it that lots of young Muslims in Europe in one way or the other are involved in kind of extremism and so on. That's something I think we have to face. But I think we have to keep in mind also a differentiation is for me quite important. And have to create a kind of balanced campaign, not making things too kind of flourishing, but also making things not too bad. I think that will be appreciated by youngsters, a kind of honest approach how to deal with the phenomena of Islam in Europe today. So thank you very much. And if you're not totally tired and exhausted, we can also have maybe some questions.